afternoon or good evening, depending on which continent you are. Some people are from Argentina, and so most people are from Europe. This is a webinar of international research project. It's called Trust in European Democracies, and it's a so-called European Europe Horizon project. It's funded by the European Union, and we are a team from 12 countries, and the project is coordinated by the team from Vienna, by Dr. Kieselova and by myself, with Vice Director from Harvard, Professor Pippa Norris. And we have here the Austrian team is Dr. Kieselova is the manager. I am the principal investigator, and Dr. Balt is our coordinator of the qualitative research. So that's the Austrian-Ukrainian team. The national director for Ukraine is Professor Irina. She's also here. And we have several other national leaders from Slovenia, Slovakia, etc. So we have these webinars every month. And today, as we are studying trust in all dimensions, and today we talk about building trust, but building trust with digital democratic innovations. So it's we are talking about how can trust be improved, how can trust be built up. And today our talk is about how to do it by using innovations, but not only by innovations like citizen assemblies, but in this case, digital democratic innovation. So it's a very interesting, innovative concept. Our distinguished speaker today is Anna Mikhaylovskaya from the University of Groningen in Netherlands. And I'm sure you have read the short description of the webinar, but I'm sure Anna will also go now into detail. We have only 1 hour, so I don't want to take too much of her time and give the floor to Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian, for this introduction, and thank you very much for having me. So just a few words before I start the presentation. So this presentation about building trust of digital democratic innovations, it's a part of my PhD project. Actually, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen. And overall, my PhD project is on the topic of digital democratic innovations, so digital tools that are used for citizen participation, right? And this was the first, the first paper within my PhD project and the first paper that got published. And that I co-authored together with my supervisor. And so without further ado, let me just share my screen. Yeah, hopefully you can see it. Can you see it? Yes, right? Okay, so build a trust with digital democratic innovations. So as I said already, this is a paper that was published now over a year ago in the Ethics and Information Technology Journal. And just to give you a bit of an outline of what I will be talking about and how I will go through it today. So first, I will give you a bit of an introduction about digital democratic innovations, right? Because I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this concept here. So I will explain a little bit of what we mean by that term, digital democratic innovations, and what kind of a concept of trust do we take into account in our paper. Then I will move on to the second part of the presentation, where I will explain a little bit the overview that we did of the trust of both citizens and decision makers and their attitudes towards this citizen participatory initiatives, because we think it's very important to take into account the existing attitudes before we can talk about like how they can be improved, right? So what are the attitudes of citizens and decision makers towards these innovations and towards citizen participation in the first place? And then in the final part of the presentation, I will explain the main contribution of our paper, right? So the suggestions that will make how digital democratic innovations can be used to build a two-sided trust, political trust, through transparency between citizens and decision makers alike. So what do we mean by digital democratic innovations? Overall, it's a kind of an umbrella term, you could say, because basically under digital democratic innovations, you can place any initiatives or institutions that are designed with the goal of deepening citizen participation, right? So citizens' influence and participation in political decision-making that is enhanced with the use of digital tools. Any kind of such initiative can be called a digital democratic innovation. And just to give you a few examples of the platforms that we have in mind when writing this paper. So, for example, on the very left, you can see like a screenshot from the website that is called Decide Madrid. It's a website based on this open source platform console that is used in actually many countries across Europe nowadays. And on this website, the residents of Madrid, they can participate in certain public consultations on such initiatives as, for example, participatory budgeting. So when citizens are invited to make suggestions on how to spend the city's budget, for example, right, in the overall in the city or in a certain neighborhood. There are also different kinds of assemblies, online assemblies taking place through this platform. So this is one example of a platform that is used in such a way as a digital democratic innovation. In the middle is another kind of platform. It was a platform designed by Stanford University and by James Fishkin as a deliberation experiment. It was called America in One Room, and essentially it was a project where they gathered a representative sample of the US population, a representative in terms of gender, age, economic class, and they discussed suggestions on climate policies around climate and energy via online platform, again, placing people in different groups so that they can discuss, deliberate together, discuss these policy suggestions, and agree on what is best and whether they agree with these proposals. So that's another example of an innovation that we have in mind when writing this paper. And on the right is an example from another part of the world. So on the right, we see an example from the platform that is called PolIS, the software that is called PolIS, and the platform is called vTaiwan. So it's a platform from Taiwan. Taiwan is also very much at the forefront of digital democratic innovations. And that platform, functions in a very different way. So it allows citizens to submit certain proposals on an issue that is being discussed, and it creates a sort of argument map, AI argument map based on the downvotes and upvotes of certain proposals. So the citizens end up seeing, for example, the disagreements between different groups, because the AI of the platform clusters citizens based on their votes into different groups. And what this platform does is, because you cannot respond to other people's proposals directly, you can only submit your own proposal. Essentially, people are motivated to submit new proposals that would bridge disagreements between different groups. And essentially, the consensus emerges eventually by submitting proposals on this platform. So this is another example of a software that we have in mind, again, when we write about digital democratic innovations. But why digital democratic innovations? So why, a little bit to explain, why do we focus on this topic at all? Why not democratic innovations more generally, right? Or citizen assemblies? So there is a general argument to be made that democratic innovations is a way of solving the so-called crisis of representative democracy, right? So what we see nowadays, and it's a pretty commonplace, in the literature nowadays, that we see a certain democratic deficit and decline of political trust all over the world, and especially, but not exclusively, in the Western democracies. So people tend to trust their governments less. They tend to get a little bit disenchanted with the current political systems. So digital democratic innovations are seen by some as arguably a solution to this crisis, to bring citizens back into the politics and to make them participate and have a more direct effect on political decision making. And why digitally? Because arguably digital democratic innovations, they can overcome certain issues that are quite common in other citizen participation initiatives. So for example, inclusiveness and scale, right? You could arguably say that in terms of inclusiveness, digitally, you could include many more people at once. You can facilitate collaboration between citizens much more easily than it is done when such initiatives take place in person. It's much easier to make information open and accessible if it's done digitally. Again, if you don't need people to commute to a certain place, right? For a citizen assembly, let's say, if everything is available online, it's much more accessible and much more open as long as people actually, have access to these digital platforms. And and it simply requires less time and resources from the side of the people to get involved. Because again, as you can imagine, of course, if we organize a citizen assembly in person, right, or a deliberation in person, that means that people either need to do it on the weekends or they need to do it in their days off, they need to commute somewhere, they need to take the time to get to a certain place. If you do citizen participation, if you try to engage people digitally, it requires less time and less resources in that sense. So the main argument in our paper towards trust and trust building through digital democratic innovations is that political trust should be conceived as a two-sided relationship. So what we see so far, like in the literature quite often when we read about trust, right, and we read about citizen participation, is that there is a lot of conversations around citizens' side of trust. So citizens trust in governments and institutions, citizens trust in participatory initiatives, in the innovations. But what we argue and what we would like to emphasize in our paper is that there is another side to this trust relationship, and it is decision makers. And by decision makers, we mean the people, the public officials, right, who are in charge of, for example, introducing certain policies, but also introducing the initiatives that strive to include citizens in political decision-making processes more. So decision makers who are responsible for introducing citizen participatory initiatives. They're also an important side of this political trust relationship. So trust should be two-sided because you cannot talk about trust of citizens in certain initiatives if you do not talk about trust of decision makers towards these initiatives, but also towards citizens themselves. So essentially, we argue that both citizens and decision makers should have trust in each other for such initiatives, citizen participatory initiatives to work. And at the same time, that both citizens and decision makers should have trust in a digital democratic innovation DDI platform itself. And that in this case, in this two-sided trust relationship, then this participatory processes and this DDI tools, they serve as a kind of mediator and facilitator of this trust relationship between citizens and decision makers. So the question essentially that we're asking, like in light of this argument of two-sided trust, is how can we design DDIs in such a way that would help to foster trust from both citizens and decision makers alike, right? So not only from one side, but from both sides of this relationship. And now I will explain a little bit about the concept of trust that we're using and why it is important. So what is trust generally, right? Like when we talk about trust, so the general conception of trust, not political trust, but more generally, right? It's a very wide topic in the literature. It's a very complex topic, but overall, like if we were to simplify, trust can be defined as a two-sided relationship where you have a certain reliance on another party's goodwill towards you, and you have a certain mutual understanding of conditions that underpin that trust. So in other words, you have a certain understanding of conditions that cannot be broken if that trust is to be maintained. So that is why we can talk about, for example, such things as betraying trust, right? If somebody betrays our trust, it means that they broke certain conditions, certain expectations that came with this like two-sided trust relationship. And in our paper, we'll focus in particular on political trust. So trust of citizens in the public sector. That's how it's usually defined, governmental institutions and officials. And as I already mentioned, essentially we argue that political trust, just like as a general conception of trust, should also be conceived of as two-sided. And it is important to emphasize that, of course, political trust, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? There are many other conditions that can affect political trust apart from the functioning of the government and the governmental institutions. Because, for instance, in a lot of literature, we find evidence that social trust seems to be a necessary, even though not the only, but a necessary basis for political trust. And by social trust, we mean like the trust that exists, overall levels of trust in society. So how trustful are people towards other people within society that they live in? So in that sense, we can talk about like countries where social trust is high and countries where social trust is quite low, for example. So how much people trust each other within a certain community, within a certain society. And in a way, political and social trust have this mutually reinforcing relationship. So meaning that, if you have high social trust, you are more likely to have high political trust, but also the other way around. And it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a loop. So it's a little bit also hard to say like which one comes first, but it seems that social trust is kind of a prerequisite, even though not the only one for political trust. And why is trust important? So why do we think it was an important topic to cover when it comes to citizen participation initiative? Well, first of all, like a very obvious and general reason, right? Like, so legitimacy of any government, even autocratic governments, rests to some extent on political trust. So if people don't have any trust in the functioning of the government, it's very hard to preserve like a legitimacy and to keep control of the government. And but at the same time, of course, good government performance is also something that helps to actually nurture political and social trust. So if the government is performing well, in the sense that people are happy with how the government is exercising certain policies, right? If people are happy with how things are going in the country, they're more likely to trust the government as well. And this, once again, putting aside that there, apart from government performance, there are other external factors that can also affect political trust, such as economic stability, right? Doesn't always depend on government performance. Some other external factors, all of that can affect political trust. But there is definitely this link between good government performance and political and social trust. Then the second reason why trust is important, specifically when we talk about citizen participation, is that high political and social trust make an introduction of any new public initiatives, such as, for example, digital democratic innovations, easier. And people in societies that have high political trust and social trust, they tend to be also more politically active and engaged overall. That's like the trend that we observe. So that's why it is very important, because essentially, you can make a conclusion that even when we talk about like building trust with these tools, right, with citizen participation tools, it is important to note that to even introduce these initiatives in the first place, political and social trust should not be too low. If it is dramatically low, if people completely distrust their government, right, if they completely distrust the system that they're living in, it doesn't matter how good the participation process that you introduce is, like it will be simply not taken on, because if the political and social trust are already too low, it's very hard to introduce any new public initiatives and to make citizens more active. And overall, trust is a crucial, it's a crucial concept for a smooth functioning of society, as is emphasized by some fundamental works, because if we don't have like some basic trust in that, some basic trust in our peers, right, in the community that we're living in, the government that we're living in, we're constantly living in a certain state of unsafety and uncertainty. So trust is an important condition actually for just the smooth functioning of society overall. So again, that brings us to a question. So how could we use digital democratic innovations to nurture this two-sided trust between decision makers and citizens, and can we use them in that way? But before we do that, it's important to talk, of course, about and understand what are the attitudes that underpin, like, currently citizens and decision makers' views towards these participatory initiatives. So if we talk about the citizens, there is plenty of empirical research about different participatory initiatives in different countries. And overall, we see that citizens are interested, on average, in having more of a say in political decision-making, but their attitudes towards specific initiatives are very context-specific, of course. But what we can see, like the trends that we can see, like overall, if we paint a general picture is that, first of all, actually citizens' pre-existing political predispositions and views play a big role when it comes to their assessment of different participatory initiatives. So, for example, citizens that are already trusting their government quite a lot are more likely to view these initiatives positively. But at the same time, citizens who are also, let's say, like, they're quite critical of their government, but they're active citizens, they're interested in politics, they follow politics, they also tend to view these initiatives quite positively. But, for example, the citizens that are completely disenchanted, the citizens that are trying to stay away from politics as much as possible, the so-called, disenchanted citizens that are so frustrated with the current status of how things are running, that they're completely disenchanted with the government, with the policies, with everything. Those people sometimes tend to become even more disenchanted when they participate in a certain initiative, depending on its results. Again, like, results influence people's views a lot. So this political predispositions and existing views matter a lot, but at the same time, we also see that process evaluation, so whether people perceived the democratic innovation as being of high quality and neutral, right? This process evaluation is very important. So what we find in certain research is that, for example, even when the outcomes of a certain initiative do not align with people's preferences. So, for example, let's say there was a citizen assembly and people submitted a certain recommendation, and that recommendation was not implemented by the government. Let's say they wanted to spend a budget, I don't know, on building a new park, and instead it was spent on something else. If the citizens perceived the process as being of high quality, neutral, and they received proper justifications of why their suggestions were not taken on, they're still more likely to see this process as positive, even if again, results didn't align with their expectations or preferences. So process evaluation matters a lot. And now we come to the decision makers' attitudes towards participatory initiatives. So again, like, that side of the coin that usually gets ignored in these conversations much more, because again, like, many people focus on the citizens' side of the question, and decision makers' side is quite often left out of this discussion of citizen participation. But why does their trust matter? So without trust from decision makers, first of all, it is very hard to introduce citizen participation in the first place. If decision makers don't have trust in the citizens and in the citizen participation as an idea, right? Why would they do it in the first place? So that is the first reason. And the second reason, even if those initiatives are implemented, right, like, and we see examples of that, like, happening sometimes in different countries, when decision makers don't have trust in the citizens and in these participatory initiatives, even when those initiatives happen, what often happens is that the decision makers end up not implementing citizens' recommendations or suggestions, because, of course, all of these instances where governments try to involve citizens in political decision-making more, most of the times they're not binding, right? Like, it's a consultative process, so citizens are asked for their opinions, but there is no obligation on the side of the government to follow up on citizens' recommendations. So As a result, if there is no real trust underpinning that relationship, these recommendations quite often are not implemented. And why is that? Like, so how do decision makers tend to see participatory initiatives? So first of all, the first reason of why this is happening and why trust is lacking is there is a general doubt in citizens' competence. And you probably also heard that yourselves, right? In conversations more generally and from some politicians that, you know, okay, people don't know enough, they don't possess enough knowledge, therefore recommendations or opinions that they give, they cannot be like a good basis for making decisions. So this is the first concern that decision makers have. Then there is another side to that, apart from doubt and general competences, there is a certain fear of binding decisions, and there is unwillingness to share power. So there is a little bit of this fear of giving away the control to the citizens, right? And the fear that they are being replaced in a way. So like as a public official, like sometimes you maybe tend to think like of, yeah, like as in what is my function if we let people like decide on certain important question, then what is my function as a public official, and why should I share this responsibility? Because you know, yeah, this is my job. Again, I worked hard to perform this function, and then suddenly citizens come in and they give me recommendations on how to do my job. Why should I share? Why should I share this power, and will I not be replaced if that is the case? So yeah, there is this fear and unwillingness from the side of decision makers. And what we also see sometimes is that, for example, in Spain, like the research by Fontenot showed, and in some other countries, that quite often, even when citizen participation initiatives actually happen, decision makers tend to cherry pick those suggestions that already align with their existing plans and their existing views, to just create this image of a public official who cares about public opinion, right? But they're actually just cherry picking the proposals that already fit their pre-existing plans. So that is done again from the side of decision makers sometimes because yeah, they want to create an image of the decision maker who cares about what the people think, but like they don't have the actual trust in citizens' capabilities. They just cherry pick those proposals that fit their purposes. But what we also see is that, again, just like with citizens, process evaluation of these participatory initiatives is crucial for decision makers' attitudes. So the more decision makers are actually involved in this citizen participation processes, and the more they see how the people give their recommendations, the more they understand about the process of how the people participate, the more likely they are to trust these processes, especially if they see them as of a high quality, neutral, right? And if they see if they properly see the value of what the people have to offer. So quite often they're skeptical about the proposals. If, for example, a citizen participation process was done by some other people, right? Decision makers just got maybe a set of like results, set of recommendations, right? They look at those recommendations and they say, okay, but where did this come from? How did that originate? And why should we be doing something with this? So the more they know about the process and the more they are able to evaluate the process, the more they actually tend to trust the citizen participation processes and citizens themselves. And this is where our argument comes in. So essentially, we argue that digital democratic innovations can be helpful in this process evaluation for decision makers and for citizens, because digital democratic innovations are the tools that can provide transparency. And transparency is which we conceive of as a sort of accountability mechanism that allows to create this feedback loop between decision makers and citizens, right? So transparency, what we mean by transparency is in a way that citizens are able to see like why decisions are being made, with what motivation, from the side of decision makers, right? So they're able to see decisions like with proper justifications. And from the side of decision makers, for example, they're able to see the logic behind citizen recommendations, how those are formed and how those originated. So this like two-sided process of transparency that ensures accountability is what we mean by transparency. And it's incredibly important for building trust. And we argue that digital innovations, digital medium is the best way or like one of the best ways to promote this element of transparency that helps to build this two-sided relationship of trust. And we propose 3 design features, and I'll go over each and every one of them in more detail in a moment. So the 3 design features that we propose for digital democratic innovations to foster trust is the first one is participatory design, the second one user-friendliness, and the third one proper justification of outcomes and opportunity for feedback. So a little bit in more detail, right? What do we mean? So participatory design of digital democratic innovations, as I mentioned like a few minutes ago. So trust is a process evaluation, right? And trust is built quite often through experiences. So the more experience, the more exposure you get to a certain process, the more you also trust it. The more you understand it, the more you trust it. As I mentioned, for example, decision makers that don't really understand the process of citizen participation, right? They don't understand, for example, in citizen assemblies or like in similar processes, how do people actually discuss, like what do they discuss, how do those recommendations from these assemblies originate? They tend to distrust those processes simply because they quite often don't know enough about them. So what we argue is essentially that it's important to involve decision makers and citizens in the design of this digital democratic innovation processes from the very beginning. So not only at the implementation stage, right, when those processes are actually implemented, but at the design stage, because the more you engage the people for whom a certain platform is built from the beginning, the more you can tailor that platform to the needs of those people. Because what we see quite often nowadays is that there are a lot of external companies, right? And some governments hire external companies and they say, okay, like you have a software for citizen participation. Yeah, let's just implement this, like let's say in our municipality or in our city. But what ends up happening is that quite often, those platforms, if you just take an outside tool without any tailoring for the local context, right? Quite often those tools don't meet the purposes and don't meet the needs of the decision makers and the citizens in that context. So it's very important to involve those people from the beginning. And it doesn't mean that you always need to create a new software from scratch, right? But it does mean that, like, for example, if you're using external software, it is important to involve the people for whom this software is actually by whom this software will be used later on. It's important to involve them from the beginning to understand what they actually need and how citizen participation will function in this particular context. And this will also help, for example, from the side of decision makers, that this will help them to see the value of citizen participation, because once again, they will be much closer to the actual process and they will be able to see for themselves much better how do this citizen recommendations form, why is it important, and they will be able to recognize the value of citizen participation much better if they are involved from the beginning and not just at the stage of receiving citizen recommendation as a result. The second element of transparency that we consider important is, of course, like user-friendliness. So very self-explanatory, but the platform for citizen participation, it should be easy to use, it should be attractive and engaging, it should be easy to navigate, right? And it should provide all the necessary information that the citizens need in order to discuss a certain issue. And this necessary information that is provided, let's say, like, for example, you want to spend a budget on something, or you want to discuss like certain policy proposals, like climate policy proposals, information about that, and like, for example, existing government plans, it should all be readily available in a user-friendly format. Because, for example, when we talk about transparency, quite often what we see nowadays with a lot of organizations, They might drop like, some very long, let's say a very complex document, right, explaining some policy or proposal, but it's written in a very bureaucratic language that is not very user-friendly, and they consider it transparent because they say, well, we put the necessary information out there, so we are being transparent. But this is not what transparency actually is. Simply putting out there some complex data, some complex unmanaged information, right? That's not enough for it to be transparent. Being transparent actually means that information is also presented in such a way that people are able to understand it. So this is what we find also a very important element. So, and it comes again both ways, right? So it not only should be user-friendly for citizens, but for example, for decision makers, it's also important for them to receive citizen recommendations in a user-friendly manner. So not simply like, let's say like thousands of comments that are completely unordered and uncategorized. So there should be a certain user-friendliness from both sides. And finally, the final element of transparency that digital democratic innovations can help provide is a proper justification of outcomes and opportunity for feedback. So what we mean by that is for digital platforms, it will be much easier, for example, for decision makers to respond to citizens' proposals. And if, for example, they reject certain proposals, to justify their decisions in a transparent and clear way. So, and for citizens, it can be also much easier via the digital means to set new agenda points and to respond to decision makers' arguments if necessary. So, for example, via digital platform, maybe you can have a certain threshold for the amount of signatures that the citizens need to reach in order to put a new topic on the agenda, right? Or in order to respond to the decision made by decision makers on the previous issue that is discussed. If the citizens, for example, don't agree with the outcome, they can, then submit like a new proposal or appeal to the decision via this platform, and this can create a sort of continuous feedback loop between decision makers and citizens. And once again, this is much easier to do in a digital way because what we see with in-person initiatives, it's usually a one-time thing, right? Like people gather in a certain place for a certain amount of days. They discuss a certain issue. They submit their recommendations. Maybe there is a follow-up meeting afterwards, but that's usually pretty much it. If you have a digital platform, this communication between citizens and decision makers can be much more continuous. And this continuity can also help to build trust long-term because it can be a discussion not around only one issue, but it can be a continuous process where you can discuss a number of issues, right, through the same platform. And this continuity and this longevity can create this trust relationship that goes much more long-term. And once again, this is exactly why we focus on digital democratic innovations and not other forms of citizen participation, because all of those elements, proper justification of outcomes, user-friendliness, right, and the others, they're much easier to achieve via the digital means. It's easier to share relevant information. It's easier to create a channel for feedback between citizens and decision makers. And it's easier to transcend physical borders for citizen participation. So in other words, as a conclusion to wrap up, we argue that digital democratic innovations can help build trust between decision makers and citizens if we implement these three design features, such as participatory design, user-friendliness, and proper justification of outcomes and opportunities for feedback. We do admit that digital democratic innovations, they should not be seen as a solution for fostering trust in a very low trust societies, right? It's not an ultimate tool to fix trust, but it can enhance and it can strengthen pre-existing levels of trust when used continuously in a society where the level of trust is not dramatically low. So it's not something that can fix trust, but it is something that can create a better relationship long-term. And at the same time, there are still things to be considered, such as questions of representativeness, inclusiveness when it comes to digital spaces, and privacy and security. And it was outside of the scope of this paper, but this is something we call upon all the practitioners and academics dealing with these topics to pay attention to when it comes to these tools. And yeah, with that, I will wrap up. And thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, I guess I'll stop sharing so that I see the people properly. But yeah, please let me know if I need to come back to some slide or if something was unclear.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was a very interesting, fascinating talk. Now the floor is open for discussion. Please raise your hand so when you want to ask questions or comment or response in some other way. I like this before somebody is thinking to raise the hand. I like it because normally in the past, this participation was always you go to the city office, you make a signature supporting this, and then you go home. There's no feedback, there's no interaction, and you have to get up, you have to get dressed and drive there. Whereas if you do it online, there's this continuity and also this exchange, which makes it much more inclusive and fascinating. Because I was writing about referenda and so on some time ago, but this was very exhausting. You had to go there, you have to register, you have to show your passport, and you have to sign the letter in the city hall and you go home. And then 6 weeks later, you get some results in the newspaper. So I think what you're proposing is much more inclusive, much more participation, and much more interactive. But that's it. So floor is open.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Yes.
Anna, thank you very much for this.
Please introduce yourself,
Yeah,
everybody.
sorry. My name is Mita Novak. I come from University of Ljubljana. I'm part of TRUEDEM project. Actually, I read your article before this webinar, before I actually knew about the webinar, and I found it very interesting. I think I especially liked your idea on sort of looking at democratic innovations also from the perspective whether the politicians have the trust in the tool. I think that basically addressed a big issue, which we also came across through our qualitative interviews, in terms of that when we spoke about participatory democracy with decision makers, they often said, yeah, but you know, citizens have weird ideas, they are not I would say they're not capable, all of them well educated. And also one additional fear that I identified with talking to them is if we invite citizens to share the ideas with us, they expect us to implement them, and we cannot implement everything. It doesn't work that way. And especially local level politicians would point out, well, you know, as many people as you ask, they all have different ideas. We built this firehouse, a new firehouse, and some say it's beautiful, and the others complain about the color, and some complain the location. So we cannot make everyone satisfied. So it's better if we decide ourselves. So that was their argument, and I think with this pointing to the trust of politicians in the tool, you basically nail the whole problem of democratic innovations. I have two questions that you haven't, I think you haven't addressed in the article, because I think they go sort of beyond your topic, and I know then it's too broad for a single paper, but maybe you have thought in this direction. One is if we could apply this, your recommendations on participatory design, user-friendliness, and proper justification also to more traditional democratic innovations. Is sort of if we're concerned with the risk of digital democratic innovations. We are here on Zoom, of course, we are very confident in digital tools, but not all people are. It's linked to the age group, to the educational group, to the social economic status. So that there are risks on data privacy, on abusing the democratic tool. So could we apply this to that? And the second question goes a little bit beyond in terms of when we speak, sort of when we look to your paper in the relationship of policymaking, we have on one side the citizens and the other side the decision makers. But in reality, the policymaking is more complex. And I'm here mostly missing the pressure groups, the interest groups, and not the civil society organizations, because they often align with the citizens, but other pressure groups. So, and they might be the reason why decision makers decide not to listen to the citizens, because there are other interests behind. So how can we sort of take also this maybe in consideration? And I know it's a big question, but if you have any thought on that. Thank you.
But thank you very much for your comments and also for the questions. It's very interesting to think about indeed. So concerning the first question, this is actually something that indeed I did think about, and my co-author did think about, and we even do make a disclaimer in the paper that a lot of the recommendations that we give, they can also be applied to the non-digital spaces. We made a conscious choice to focus on the digital spaces because we do believe in this potential of the digital tools to provide this transparency and to provide this medium that is much more accessible in certain ways, right? But like indeed, we by no means are saying that any kind of other democratic innovations or initiatives are invalid, or that we should just like put aside everything that is happening in person and just do everything digitally. No, we just want to emphasize the value of these digital spaces and to emphasize their promise, right? And the potential that they have. But at the same time, both the participatory design and the user friendliness and the transparency of information, right, that can be just as easily applied to in-person initiatives. And in general, I think like the more useful way of thinking about these digital democratic innovations is not as something that will necessarily replace the in-person initiatives, but more like something that will create an additional channel of participation, an additional channel of connection between the government and decision makers, right, and the people. So just additional channel that makes the overall system more inclusive. But it doesn't mean that we should just say like, oh, okay, now we do everything digitally, right, and everything that is in person, we don't do that anymore. But it is also important when we think about digital innovations, it is important that those processes are continuous, because I think like the mistake that a lot of organizers make and that a lot of people make is that they create a certain platform, right? They try it once, people don't use it enough from the beginning, and they say, okay, well, this idea didn't work because people are not using it, so we will stop trying. But that's not how those things work. You need to be quite persistent to introduce this kind of new public services, and you need to do it continuously in order for people to actually start using them more actively, because it doesn't just happen like overnight, right? There is a certain process of continuity behind it. And concerning your second question, that's quite a big topic. So remind me a little bit.
It was regarding if we sort of think about policy making and add an additional
the additional interest groups. No, that is true, because indeed, like depending on the context, right, there are a lot of other groups apart from decision makers and citizens at play here. But again, I think like here, this continuity, right, and this kind of awareness of this process and this involvement of decision makers more into understanding what is actually standing behind the citizen initiatives, how they function, is a little bit of the answer. Because of course you always have like different interest groups that affect any kind of political process, but so those interest groups equally affect other political processes that we currently accept as a standard, right? Elections, like voting, all kinds of interest groups lobby and affect those processes on a daily basis, and we still consider those processes legitimate. So I think it's just a matter of kind of exposure and continuity for people to learn that that's a reality, but that's not a reason not to do it, right? Because there's different interest groups. They can of course have an influence and can have their own agenda, but they equally have it in the democratic systems that we have right now. Yeah, it's a matter of dealing with that.
Yeah, I think now you made me think of it. I think it goes it's true because we actually have evidence that when issues are more salient, so more close to the public, the pressure groups are more on the side of losers than winners. So it actually confirms your sort of point on sticking to the democratic innovations and using them. Thank you very much for your answers.
No worries. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments? I think it's important. We have regional elections in the region of Vienna, and there small parties have to collect signatures. So people have to go to the office of the district. They have to find somebody from the party. He brings them into the building to sign something. If you do it online, the participation in these elections is much better, much easier. Of course, the existing parties try to make it difficult because they don't want competition. But in terms of inclusion, this would be much better to do it also digital. But the next is Anastasios and then Claudia. Anastasios?
Hello, everyone. I'm Anastasios from Greece. I'm a PhD candidate in the Computer Engineering Informatics Department of the University of Patras. My question was just answered on the chat about the name of one of the platforms initially presented. So thank you for that.
No worries. Yeah.
Thank you for the interesting presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasios. Claudia from the Austrian team.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for the presentation. I'm part of the TRUEDEM team, and we got a certain part of the work package which dealt with deliberative forms of democracy. And we made a collection of all the countries. Which forms do we have on a local, municipal level, on a national, federal level? And I also had a lot of interviews with politicians, and it was kind of a mirror study. So we asked them what they think about. What turned out to be the more conservative politicians were, the more they said, we don't need that. Indirect forms of democracy are enough. Direct form was kind of far beyond the goal, and deliberative is not like it's wishful thinking. We have a lot of platforms here in Austria where you can bring in petitions like Dr. Herpfer mentioned. The thing is, since we have that, it was possible like with a signature on your mobile phone, and now we have an ID Austria. It's a card where you can do like just not go voting or take place or go to petitions online and sign them online. So since then it has increased, and it increased in that way that people go online, they want to sign for one petition, and then they sign for 5 or 6. And so they don't differentiate what do they really want to do. And as a matter of that, people bringing in citizens and initiatives got more and more, because Austria was very fond of that these initiatives grow. And if you bring up a citizen initiative, you get a certain amount of money. So what happened is that they say, I do an initiative against smoking and for smoking. And so a lot of initiatives came up. This is a critical point. And as you mentioned, private platforms, where we don't know where they come from. But one point for me, which is really interesting, what about the transparency of like petitions and all the processes, deliberative processes? Actually, if you vote for someone, you know who's behind it, or an interest group, a pressure group, like a federation or whatever. But sometimes some players hide behind these petitions, or you don't know who brought them in. Do you think it's a fear? Has to be regulated anyway, or do you say no? It's a normal process.
Interesting question, indeed. So yeah, if you have certain interest groups pushing for something, I mean, I think it's also a matter of a little bit still like having trust in those processes and having trust in the people, because you can start a petition, right? And the petition can start a certain process, but that petition would still need to gather a certain amount of signatures. For example, for it to even be considered seriously, let's say by municipality or by government. And yeah, depending on the process, if it comes to petitions, right, if the government is not under obligation to implement it, then again, it comes down to justifying why you're not doing it, right, and justifying it in such a way that that makes sense and that is transparent. So I don't necessarily think that it would be like that dangerous. I think, yeah, more danger people usually see like with such initiatives if we think about referendums, right? This is usually where people like remember Brexit and those kind of things. But I think like what we also often forget with this like deliberative process is quite often this misinformed or like decisions that citizens take when they're like not well informed are quite often done through the platforms or through social media that were never made with the goal of having this democratic participation.
My additional question is from the point of view of you said of the people. You said that people want to have a say. My question is, which people? Where do they come from? Who are they? So do you have more? We went through a lot of studies, but you always hear it's a kind of elite model, but no one has proved it. There's not so many empirical data about it. Do you know or have any data showing which people are these others, the younger elite ones, the better educated and so on and so forth, or not?
Yeah, there are some studies, not by me, but there are some studies that were made, right? And it's actually like depending on the context, we do see that quite often, like at least initially at first in these initiatives, like people who are most interested to participate are those who are already politically active, right? So we do see like a certain, and that's why I mentioned towards the end that also questions such as inclusiveness and representativeness need to be considered, because we do see this discrepancy in the sense that people who are already politically active are the ones who are most active on these platforms. But I think, again, like here, the question is of when you introduce those things first, like, of course, the first people that will come will be those who are politically active. But I think like here, it's of course, a little bit of a yeah, preliminary, like there is no empirical data to support it currently, right? But I think like if you do these processes continuously, and if people do see that, like, you know, okay, this process do get certain outcomes, certain recommendations do get implemented, that this process do work, that eventually you would have more and more people participating because they will see that, okay, these processes do work, and we see these people who were politically active, like achieving certain things through this process. So the hope is that, like, if you do this process continuously, more people would become politically active as well. But
thank you, but you have a very optimistic view. I'm not quite sure if I should share it to 100%, but it's a good approach, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but thank you for the question. And I do think we have examples of, for example, countries like, if we talk about digital services and digital participation, right? For example, countries like Estonia that have a lot of like government services provided digitally, right? And a lot of the things that you can do digitally. But people tend to forget that when it was first introduced in Estonia many years ago, a lot of people were not very enthusiastic about many of those. A lot of people, you know, had the same arguments of like, oh, but we did all these things like non-digitally. Why do we have to do it digitally now? It worked before. Why change things? But because, because the process was continuous, because the process was not abandoned, because it was persistent, over time, like people did start like finding it convenient and did see the benefit of doing things like via this digital means. So I think there is an argument to be made that this like continuous exposure to certain experiences does encourage people to use.
We must not lose the older ones, because now I do it for my parents, you know, because they have me. But it always has to be provided on both lines.
Exactly. It needs to be both channels.
So don't, if they say it's so popular, just kick out. We don't need the old ones or whatever.
No.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's a very important contribution to the theory of political capital. Political capital is voting, political interest, but also this digital participation can be an additional new dimension how to create and how to measure political capital. So it might be also some theoretical innovation for the concept of political capital, which is very exciting, at least for
Yeah.
me.
Oh, thank you, Christian. Thank you very much.
Yes, so I think we are at the
Oh,
end
yeah,
of
we're
our
out of
time.
time.
Is there any final comment, question to Anna? This seems not to be the case. So thank you very much. The paper was very interesting, very innovative, also in terms of the theory of capital. And Xenia wants to have the last word. I know she wants to clap. Okay.
but-
Congratulations. It was
Uh,
brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I'll keep an eye on your project and on other webinars as well. It's very nice to get to know you.
Please watch
yes.
us and follow us carefully and criticize us.
Yeah. In a nice way. We'll do.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you all
you.
for coming.
Thank you,
and
everybody.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.